On January 2nd, 1971, Glasgow woke up gray, like so many other winter days. The cold was dry, biting, but not enough to extinguish the excitement that had been running through the city since early morning. It was not just any day. It was Old Firm. Rangers versus Celtic. Blue versus green. Two halves of the same city facing each other for decades, not only over football, but over identity, religion, and belonging. Ibrox Park Stadium, imposing and solemn, had begun to fill hours before kickoff. More than 80,000 people passed through its entrances, climbed concrete stairways, and searched for their usual spots. Many repeated rituals, the same seat, the same entrance, the same staircase. No one imagined that this habit, this seemingly innocent routine, would be key to what was about to happen. Ibrox already had a history, not just a sporting one. In 1902, the stadium had been the scene of a tragedy when a stand collapsed during an international match, leaving dozens dead. Since then, the name Ibrox lived alongside a silent warning. But time, as always, had done its job, erasing fear, normalizing risk, turning memory into a footnote. By 1971, British football was living through an era of massive fervor. Safety measures were minimal compared to today's standards. There was no electronic crowd control, no clear evacuation plans, and the architecture of many stadiums responded more to capacity than to safety. Ibrox was no exception. The match began with intensity. Rangers and Celtic fought for every ball as if it were the last. The noise was deafening. Chants, insults, blows against the railings. The stadium literally vibrated. The first half passed without goals, but with constant tension. In the second half, Celtic took the lead. The murmur turned into anxiety. Some Rangers supporters began to move before the final whistle, fearing being trapped in the crowd if the result did not change. That movement, almost imperceptible at first, concentrated at a specific point in the stadium. Stairway 13, a wide, steep staircase, built of concrete, connecting one of the stands with the main exit. It was one of the most used. Many knew it by heart. They had climbed up and down it hundreds of times. With only minutes left, something no one expected happened. Rangers equalized the match. The stadium exploded. Shouts, jumps, embraces. The goal changed everything in seconds. Some who were already going down Stairway 13 stopped. Others, who had decided to stay until the end, began moving toward the exit, believing the match was over. Two opposing human flows began to meet in a space that was not prepared for that. There was no immediate stampede. There was no panic at first. It was something far more silent and dangerous. A constant, growing, irresistible pressure. People pushed unintentionally, bodies compressed, feet no longer touching the ground. It only took someone to stumble for the collective balance to break. Stairway 13 became a trap. While the match continued on the field, oblivious to what was happening out of the players' sight, dozens of people began to fall on top of one another. The weight of the crowd made it impossible to get up. Cries for help were drowned out by the noise of the stadium. No one yet understood the magnitude of what was happening. When the referee blew the final whistle, the draw was already anecdotal. Something far more serious was unfolding. The first to arrive at the scene were paralyzed. Piled bodies, unconscious people, hats, scarves, shoes scattered across the ground. Football had been pushed into the background within minutes. Ambulances began to arrive, but access was difficult. The stadium was not designed for a mass medical evacuation. Police officers, volunteers, and spectators tried to help however they could, without training, without coordination. Some improvised stretchers with torn-off doors. Others tried to resuscitate strangers on the cold ground of Glasgow. As night fell, the numbers began to become clear and devastating. 66 people had died. Most were crushed. Others suffocated. They were of different ages, different stories, but shared one thing. They had gone to watch a football match and never returned home. Scotland would wake the next day immersed in silence. Ibrox would no longer be just a stadium. It would be a symbol, an open wound, an uncomfortable question about how far sport had ignored safety in the name of passion. But this tragedy was not just an accident. It was the consequence of years of ignored warnings, dismissed reports, and a culture that normalized danger. And that was only beginning to come to light. When the lights of Ibrox went out that night, the stadium fell silent for the first time in decades. It was not the silence after a match, but a much heavier one, almost physical. A silence that belonged not only to the place, but to all of Scotland. News of the disaster began to spread across the country at an unusual speed for the time, and with each update, the impact grew deeper. 66 dead, more than 200 injured, entire families waiting for news outside hospitals, scanning handwritten lists, searching for names that, in many cases, would never appear. The initial question was simple and brutal. How could this happen again at Ibrox? Because it was not the first time. In the hours that followed, journalists, engineers, and officials began reviewing archives, forgotten reports, technical documents that had been gathering dust for years. And what they found was unsettling. The tragedy was not only avoidable, it had been announced in advance. Stairway 13 was not unknown to the authorities. Since the 1950s, internal reports had pointed out problems in the stadium's exit areas. They did not speak of an abstract possibility, but of something concrete: crowd accumulation, frequent pushing at the end of matches, recurring stumbles. In other words, clear signs of a structural risk. But British football in the mid-20th century operated under a dangerous logic. If there were no deaths, there was no problem. Stadiums were designed to contain crowds, not to protect them. The emphasis was on capacity, not on flow. The more people got in, the better. Supporters were treated as a uniform mass, not as vulnerable individuals. And that mindset permeated every decision. After the disaster, official statements began. Rangers Football Club expressed its deep regret and promised to cooperate with the investigation. Local authorities spoke of a tragic accident, carefully chosen words. No one wanted to talk yet about responsibility. However, as the days passed, personal stories began to take center stage. Parents who had gone with their children, friends who separated at the exit and never met again, people who survived by inches, literally crushed but alive, carrying since then a silent trauma. Survivors agreed on one thing: there was no initial panic. There was no irrational stampede. What happened was slower and, precisely because of that, more lethal. A human pressure that grew without anyone being able to stop it. A force that is not perceived until it is already impossible to escape. Experts began to speak of the funnel effect, a phenomenon well known in crowd engineering. Too many people trying to pass through a space that cannot absorb them at the same time. Stairway 13 had rigid railings, uneven steps, and a steep slope. It only took one person to fall for the entire system to collapse. And that is exactly what happened. The most disturbing part was that none of this was new. Something similar had already occurred in other stadiums in the United Kingdom. Studies already existed warning about the dangers of standing terraces, narrow exits, and lack of control over crowd movement. But those studies rarely translated into concrete actions. Why? The answer was uncomfortable. Updating a stadium cost money. Redesigning access points meant closing sections. Reducing capacity meant losing revenue. In a football world that was becoming an ever bigger business, safety was seen as an expense, not an investment. As the official investigation progressed, a clear pattern emerged. No one wanted to be the one to raise their hand and say, "This is dangerous," out loud. Engineers warned executives. Executives trusted that nothing serious had ever happened. Municipal authorities delegated responsibilities. And so, the risk dissolved until it disappeared, at least on paper. Public pressure began to grow, not only in Glasgow, but across the country. How many other stadiums were in similar conditions? How many more tragedies were needed to change something? Images of Ibrox began to be compared with other sporting catastrophes of the past, and the word negligence began to appear more frequently in headlines. But the hardest part was still missing: determining who was responsible. Because when blame is structural, there is not always a single culprit. There are small decisions, repeated over years, that together form a tragedy. And accepting that meant admitting that the Ibrox disaster was not an anomaly, but the logical result of a system that had failed. Meanwhile, the stadium remained closed, empty, watched. Stairway 13, cordoned off, became the most powerful symbol of the entire disaster. An everyday space transformed into a scene of death, a physical reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored for too long. But the story was not over yet. Because what happened after the disaster, the investigations, the conclusions, and above all, the decisions that were made or not made, would forever change the relationship between football and safety in the United Kingdom. And not everyone was satisfied with those conclusions. As the days passed, the immediate pain began to transform into something more complex and persistent: the need for answers. Tributes were no longer enough, nor scarves hung on the fences of Ibrox, nor minutes of silence before matches. 66 people had died, and the entire country demanded to know why. Not just how it happened, but who should be held responsible. The British government quickly announced the opening of a public inquiry. At its head would be Lord Wheatley, a respected judge, tasked with analyzing what happened at Ibrox and determining the causes of the disaster. For many, that investigation represented a historic opportunity, the chance that football would finally stop looking the other way. The hearings began months later. Witnesses of all kinds appeared before the tribunal. Survivors, police officers, stadium staff, engineers, municipal officials. Each contributed a piece of the puzzle. And little by little, the image that formed was unsettling in its clarity. There was no stampede caused by panic. There was no violence. There was no sudden structural failure. What there was a predictable accumulation of people at a poorly designed point, combined with a total absence of control over human flow. The report began to use uncomfortable words: negligence, known deficiencies, lack of supervision. Stairway 13 returned to the center of the scene. Its dimensions, its incline, the material of the steps, the placement of the railings were analyzed. Photographs taken years before the disaster were reviewed, clearly showing crowds packed into that same spot at the end of other matches. It was not a new scenario. It was a time bomb. One of the most tense moments of the investigation came when internal documents were presented showing that minor incidents had already been reported on that staircase. Stumbles, falls, pushing. Nothing fatal, but enough to raise alarms. However, those warnings never translated into real changes. Why? The answer was once again uncomfortable, because no one had a clear legal obligation to act. The club managed the stadium, but inspections depended on local authorities. Authorities trusted that the club would meet standards, and the standards themselves were vague, outdated, and in many cases optional. The Wheatley report was forceful in its technical conclusions. It stated that the disaster was caused by extreme compressive force in the crowd, resulting from the meeting of opposing flows in an insufficient space. It only took one person to fall for the balance to break and the pressure to become lethal. But when it came time to assign direct responsibility, the tone changed. There were no criminal charges against club executives. There were no individual convictions. There were no clear culprits. The tragedy was officially classified as an avoidable accident, yes, but without criminal responsibility. For many families, that was a second blow. They were not seeking revenge, but recognition. They wanted someone to say plainly, "This should not have happened." Even so, the report had profound consequences. Lord Wheatley recommended a series of changes that, over time, would transform British stadiums. Mandatory improvements to access and exits, the gradual elimination of dangerous standing areas, stricter capacity controls, and above all, a new way of understanding safety as a central priority. Paradoxically, those recommendations were slow to be applied uniformly. Many clubs considered them excessive. Others cited lack of budget. Football, once again, moved at a slower pace than the memory of its dead. Ibrox, for its part, underwent significant renovations. Stairway 13 was modified, access points were redesigned, exits widened. The stadium reopened, but it was never the same. For many supporters, returning was an act filled with contradictory emotions. Love for the club, but also fear, respect, mourning. In Scottish football culture, the disaster left a silent mark. For years, it was avoided as a topic of open conversation, as if naming it were a way of reliving it. However, every January 2nd, the families of the victims gathered to remember. Names, ages, cut short stories. The investigation had officially closed the case, but it had not closed the wound. And the most unsettling thing was that, despite everything learned, British football still had not changed enough. Many stadiums remained potential traps. Many warnings continued to be filed away. The sense that another tragedy could occur at any moment hung in the air. Ibrox had sent a clear signal. It had shown the human cost of indifference. But the real question was another. Had it been enough? The answer, tragically, would come years later, in another stadium with other names and with an all-too-familiar echo. For a time, it seemed that the Ibrox disaster had achieved the impossible, shaking the foundations of British football. Reports circulated, recommendations were cited at technical conferences, and the word safety began to appear more frequently in boardroom meetings. However, beneath that apparent transformation, something remained the same. Change was slow, too slow. Football, as an institution, has a short memory, and when tragedies fade from the headlines, the drive to reform dissipates. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, many stadiums in the United Kingdom continued operating with old structures designed for another era. Packed standing terraces, narrow access points, insufficient exits. Ibrox had been a warning sign, but not a definitive turning point. Technical reports warned of a common pattern. The real danger was not panic, but normality. Crowds moving as always, confident, following learned routines, entering through the same gate, leaving through the same staircase, stopping at the same points. That predictability, combined with deficient infrastructure, was lethal. But accepting that meant accepting something even more uncomfortable, that the problem was not the supporters, but the system. By the late 1970s, minor incidents began to accumulate at various stadiums. Congestion, pushing, people injured in collapsed exits. Each was treated as an isolated episode. Bad luck, a scare, nothing more. Exactly the same approach that had preceded the Ibrox disaster. Meanwhile, the profile of the audience was changing. Football attracted more people, matches increasingly charged with tension, intense rivalries, stadiums filled to the limit. The pressure on old structures increased match after match. And yet, deep reforms continued to be postponed. In 1985, two tragedies shook British and European football just weeks apart. First, the fire at Bradford Stadium, where a wooden stand went up in flames within minutes, killing 56 people. Then, the Capsule disaster in Belgium during a European final, with 39 dead after the collapse of a wall and chaos in the stands. The names changed, the immediate causes varied, but the pattern was the same. Obsolete infrastructures, lack of control, ignored warnings. Each tragedy brought the memory of Ibrox back to the table. Journalists and experts began to say it openly. This had already happened. Not once, several times. And yet, football kept reacting afterward, never before. For the families of the 1971 victims, that repetition was unbearable. Many of them began to raise their voices, demanding that the memory of Ibrox be not only commemorative, but preventive. That their dead not become just another statistic on a growing list. But the true turning point was still to come. In 1989, 18 years after Ibrox, the Hillsborough disaster would mark a definitive before and after. 96 people would die crushed in a stadium, under circumstances chillingly reminiscent of what had happened in Glasgow. Once again, There was no initial panic. Once again, the crowd was compressed. Once again, exits and control failed. Hillsborough forced British football to confront a truth that Ibrox had already exposed. The enemy was not the crowd, but institutional negligence. Only then did deep reforms arrive. Stadiums remodeled or demolished. All-seater stands, strict safety protocols, real capacity control, measures that, in hindsight, seemed obvious, but had taken decades to implement. Ibrox, in that new context, began to be seen not only as a tragedy, but as an early warning. A point at which the course could have changed before other lives were lost. A warning that, had it been taken seriously, could have prevented later disasters. Today, when Europe's great football catastrophes are analyzed, the second Ibrox disaster occupies a particular place. It is not the most famous. It is not the most media covered, but it is one of the most revealing, because it shows with brutal clarity how the repetition of errors is possible even when the lessons are written in blood. The stadium still stands. Football continued. The chants returned. But beneath every renovated step, beneath every reinforced railing, there is a story that cannot be erased. And the final question remains the most unsettling of all. How many lives are needed for a warning to be heard in time? There are tragedies that are fixed to an exact date, a day, an hour, place. The second Ibrox disaster is one of them. Every January 2nd, Glasgow remembers, not as an empty symbolic act, but as a necessity, because forgetting in this case is not an option. Ibrox Stadium remains the home of Rangers Football Club, modernized, renovated, adapted to current standards. At first glance, nothing seems out of place. Exits are wide, access points are signposted, controls are strict. Modern football learned, at least in part, the lessons that Ibrox left behind. But beneath that normality, an echo persists. 66 names are engraved on memorials, on silent plaques that many supporters look at without stopping for long. Not out of indifference, but out of respect. Because stopping is remembering that this place, now safe, was once deadly. That the same route walked today without thinking was, at another time, a trap. Over the years, the official narrative of the disaster has been refined. It is no longer spoken of only as an unfortunate accident. It is spoken of as a chain of human decisions, of misplaced priorities, of a system that allowed passion to move faster than responsibility. The legacy of Ibrox is not measured only in architectural reforms. It is measured in cultural changes, in how stadiums are designed today, in how a crowd is managed, in the still fragile awareness that the spectacle can never be above life. However, that legacy came at an enormous cost, and one of the most painful questions still has no definitive answer. Why did it take repeating the tragedy in other places for the warnings of Ibrox to be taken seriously? For the families of the victims, the passage of time does not soften the loss, transforms it. It makes it part of a larger struggle, keeping memory alive so that no one can say, "We didn't know," because at Ibrox it was known, and yet it happened. Today, the survivors who are still alive tell their story with a mix of precision and silence. They remember tiny details: a scarf on the ground, a lost shoe, a hand that tried to grab the railing, moments frozen in time, fragments of a day that never fully ended. Football changed, stadiums changed, but risk never disappears completely. It is only controlled, only managed, and when that management fails, history shows that the result is always the same. Ibrox is, in that sense, a permanent warning, not only for football, but for any event that brings together crowds. It reminds us that tragedies are rarely sudden. They are processes, accumulations, decisions that seem small, until they are not. And perhaps that is why the second Ibrox disaster should not be told as an isolated episode of the past, but as part of a much broader series. An uncomfortable series, painful, necessary, because Ibrox was not the first. And sadly, it was not the last. In another stadium, in another country, with other victims. History would repeat itself. And that is another story that deserves to be told.